So today we have Adam Leonberger presenting. Adam is one of the co-hosts of this series, and he is the horticulture extension agent at the Franklin County Farmers Market. And he is going to be, what did I say? The Franklin County Extension Office. And I'm struggling today, obviously. The Franklin County Extension Office, and he is going to be presenting on the vegetable gardening. So take it away, Adam.
Let me find the right buttons again. Share. What is going on? There it goes. Can everybody see that? Is that showing up?
Yes.
Okay. Just try to get my screen's clear so I can kind of see what's going on. And make sure I'm not muted. Talk a little bit about planting and maintaining your garden, or how does your garden grow? Nope, not the right button. Where is my? There it is. So big question is, why do we even want to start a vegetable garden? Really, it's one of those things that you can start growing the vegetables that you normally buy at the grocery store. What kind of things do you want to grow? What will grow in your area? What do you have room for, and what's your time allotment for it? So those are kind of things, like if you have time, it's a good idea to kind of, it's one of those options you can save some money and get some exercise and enjoyment at the same time. Where are my controls? There it goes. So one of the reasons that we might want to grow vegetables on our own is for the freshness and taste of it. Local farms, a lot of times we really like that, looking for the vine ripened in the grocery store. Even those that have been vine ripened, since they're picked ripe, they're still takes time to deteriorate, lose taste in the shipping. If you can't grow it yourself, next best thing is to try to get local, but even that's a lot of times picked the day before. That may not matter, and might not be a perceptible difference, but it doesn't quite compare to going into your garden and within minutes being able to eat that. Some other benefits of that, of growing a garden, it's great physical and mental exercise and relaxation. If you want something different than what the grocery store has, you can always grow something new. You're never going to be able to find some of the weird, different varieties that you can grow on your own. And nutrition, the fresher the vegetable is, the less time the vitamins have to deteriorate. And also, if you have it, if available, you're more likely to consume it as well. So if it's in your backyard, all you have to do is take a few steps out there. It's a lot more easily accessible than it is to have to go to the store when you've run out of vegetables at that point. There it goes. There it goes. Keep missing my buttons. As far as where to put your garden, this is kind of one of the points where people start getting confused about where they have to put it. The critical things are that you can get full sun is really ideal. And by that, we mean at minimum 6 to 8 hours. If you can get it more sunlight, the plants would do better, but really 6 to 8 hours is kind of that minimum time period. You want to get it away from trees as much as possible. Not only are they going to shade the plants out, but also those roots are going to be competing for water and nutrients as well. And we're really looking for a well-drained soil. And this isn't just necessarily does the water is on a hillside and drains off quickly. It's more of, once the soil goes into the soil, does it drain well, or does it stay wet for long periods of time? Really looking for well-drained soils that can, that way we can keep those plants good and healthy. If your soils are a heavy clay and they are not draining out well, that's where tools such as using raised beds can assist with that. Other things you want to stay away from would be septic drain fields. If you have a septic drain field, you would want to make sure that you're not planting any edibles over top of it. Those roots can get down into it, and pathogens can't, the septic field, drain fields are not quite deep enough to really fully guarantee that any pathogens aren't going to come back up, grow back up out of the soil and onto our foods. That's really the biggest thing, is that fact that we are eating things there. Perfectly fine to play over top of them, be on top of the septic drain fields, but you don't want to be eating things over top of the drain fields. Level areas are preferred. It just makes it a lot easier to work, especially if you're doing any kind of equipment, using any equipment on top of that. If you don't have a sloped area, or if you are in a sloped area, doesn't mean you can't garden. You just might have to look at either containers or some terraced gardens into it, into the slopes. Another big thing that a lot of people fail to realize is that a lot of times they want to put that garden all the way in the back corner because they don't think it's as pretty as it could be. And you really want to keep it as close as possible. The closer it is to the garden, to your residence, or to where you are, you're gonna see it more often. Which is gonna remind you that you need to go take a walk through there for any week, or do any other work within that garden. So the closer it is, the more convenient it is for you to go out there and to use that garden. Other big thing to deal with site selection. In the springtime, it doesn't always seem like it's a big issue, but you always want to kind of think about, once we get to that dry period in summer, how are you going to irrigate it if we get into a drought? Do you have enough hoses to get over to it? Do you want to be dragging the hoses, a couple hundred feet to your garden, or do you just want to be able to have it nearby, a single 100-foot hose or a 50-foot hose to be able to water it? Or are you perfectly fine, hauling buckets back and forth? Tool storage, do you want, same thing with the water, a couple shovels or tools don't seem that heavy to carry the first time, but it's really, how inconvenient is it if you get all the way, you have to walk, a couple hundred feet from tool storage, from where you store your tools to your garden, you realize you forget something, because I don't know about you, but I never remember to grab all my tools at the same time, or realize halfway through I need a different tool. So then you're walking back and forth multiple times. Take some of the enjoyment out of it when you have to, keep walking back and forth. Once we kind of are, now that we got some of the ideas about what we're looking for, a good idea for figuring out where to put the vegetable garden is to map it out. And this is just, draw a scale model of what you're looking at your garden. Ideally, I would actually start kind of at the landscape level, the entire property, start mapping out, where the buildings, trees, anything, other landscape beds, and that way, and make sure you put a north arrow so you kind of understand. That'll help you kind of figure out where the shade will be at some point. Once you kind of get the overall things that are there, you want to kind of start looking at breaking out. I would always kind of map out where the areas you're already using. That kind of lets you know what areas are free to develop into vegetable gardens or orchards. From there you can break down once you kind of get those where you think that the vegetable garden should be, or the orchard, you can kind of break down, kind of zoom in, start drawing a specific plan for where you're going to put your spring crops, how you're going to put the summer and any fall and winter gardens you might want to do. So just for example, here's just a quick property. You've got the house sketched out. This is in Paint, I think I did it. Something simple like that. You can easily just grab a piece of paper, graph paper. Google Maps works pretty well to at least get the general layout of these things. I've done that here for the office multiple times. Just print off a map of the Google Maps, put another piece of paper over it, and kind of quickly draw everything, all the permanent structures in, just so you have, everything generally to scale. Here's adding the trees to it. Do I have, sorry, I'm not as savvy with it. I'm just looking for, do I have laser pointer? Okay, well, I don't know where that's at. Anyhow, you've got the trees marked down in kind of the green stars, various size trees. You've got any fencing put in, just kind of general things that might be physical things. You've got a shed garden at that point. And this is just kind of what I was talking about as far as like general like usage areas. So if you have a general existing garden, you know, do you want to expand out the garden at some point? Do you want to add a chicken coop, small fruits? Where are you want to hang out at? If outside, do you have any kids that you need play structures for? Those kind of things. This is kind of the bubble diagram to kind of figure out the usage. Where can you put a garden, or where can you expand your garden further into? Another big thing that goes along with the mapping is not only should you map the garden, but you also should keep notes of what you're growing, what's happening in it. You know, how much that'll let you kind of know, keeping those records over time will kind of help direct you and refine how much of each crop do you need, what did you like, how did certain varieties or certain plants perform. Kind of helps you kind of put those together. Some of the questions, you know, how much should you grow per person? This is where a lot of this is going to reference our home vegetable gardening guide, our ID 128. It is available online, and I've got the link. Easiest is to find is to search UKY ID 128. On page 16, we've got an example. It's kind of got a list of how many crops per person for that. So that's a nice way to do it. Kind of organizing it, you want to lump perennials together. Make sure that your taller plants aren't shading out. So if you're doing your garden in rows, making sure that those rows go north-south or into north-south is important. That way, if you have corn in the middle of it, if you go with east-west, you put corn on that south side on that row, it's going to shade everything behind it, which, you know, can be a benefit if you're doing things like lettuce in the summer, but tomatoes right behind it are going to suffer. As far as this getting that garden established, once we start thinking about actually planting, before we get into that, you really want to do a soil test. There's no way of looking at that soil, feeling it, touching it, tasting it, to know what exactly is in it, what's a good soil. Starting off that soil test, that lets you know, does it have the right pH? Do you need any fertilizer, lime, sulfur? That needs to go into this before you put into the soil before you plant it. When you get your result, if you send the sample through UK, it's $6 through the extension service. Some counties have found other funding to be able to subsidize or to either subsidize that to lower cost or make it free. So once you get that back, it'll come back as a report similar to this. There are a bunch of numbers at the top of it. These are really more of numbers that are more what we use, essentially the data that we use to make our recommendations down below. So there's always going to be a box down below that's going to have the extensionation notes. That'll kind of have more of the tailored specific one from us, recommending what for that site, you know, what for that space. One of the big things that I was saying is the pH. This is just how acidic or basic the soil is. Ideally, you want it for most of your vegetable plants, it's going to be between 6.2, 6.8 pH. The reason for that is if you look at it's what's circled there, that's where the most amount of the plant nutrients are available. So that's the reason that we want to keep it within that range. It is still a range, so if you are having some, you know, you could always take, if you are trying to grow a large number of vegetables, hitting that 6.2, 6.5 is really a good middle of the road place. You can see here, this is just that showing the different plants that have the different pH requirements for the different plants. You know, things like asparagus aren't nearly as tolerant as, you know, potatoes or eggplants on that point. So asparagus at the top can go 6 to 8 in pH. Potatoes really grow best between 5 to 6.5. So there is a wide range of what plants prefer and can grow in. The ideal, that is the ideal pH range. It's not a hard fast rule that you have to have it in this point. If you have, when that pH comes back, if it's outside of that range, we usually make a recommendation. You're using either lime to raise that pH to a higher number that makes it more alkaline, more basic, or using sulfur to lower it, make it more acidic. It is important to note that lime is not a fertilizer. It doesn't make the plants necessarily grow better if the pH is already in the right range. Adding lime is not going to make those plants grow better. Just because Grandpa always did it doesn't mean that it was the right way. We've got better research and better data into soil chemistry and plant growth that shows that it really is best in this range. As far as if you're doing a new site, a lot of times this means that we're at home, we're doing this into existing turf. Really some sort of tillage is going to be required to kind of break that soil up. This is just a matter of using mechanically kind of breaking the soil, turning it over. It can be, you can do it by hand with a shovel. I've done it before. It's really labor intensive and not my recommended route if you don't have to. It's really best if you're just going to do a small site, small garden. You can definitely get away with that. It's best to either remove the sod or either with a sod cutter or shovel, or turn it over in the fall. That way the grass has a chance to kind of decompose and break down. Otherwise, if that grass is decaying, it's going to tie up some of the nitrogen in the soil and make it not available to the new plants. Another big reason that you want to do some tillage at the beginning of a new garden is if that site needs any amendments, any fertilizer, compost, lime. That's a great time to incorporate that into the soil and turn that in and mix it into the soil profile itself. Adding amendment. And you want to make sure that you use adding those lime and fertilizer according to that soil test. If you have heavy clay soils, this is your time that you can help really do a great time. You can start breaking that up and making that a lighter soil. You do not want to add gypsum in most of the case. It chemically can change the soil and make it slightly less heavy, but it's not really going to have the effect that most people expect it to be. Also, you want to make sure that you never add sand to clay soils. That's just going to create adobe or concrete. If you have those hard soils, you really want to, if you're trying to break up those heavy clay soils, the best thing there is to add organic matter. So this can be anything. Organic matter can be anything from compost or manure, animal bedding, stuff like that from horse beddings. Any lawn clippings, you can even use wood chips. You want to make sure cover crops, leaves, compost. Wood chips, if you mix them into the soil, can tie up some nitrogen, so you want to put those in ahead of time to have a chance to break down, or at least use them on top so as they break down, they're adding organic matter to the soil. All the others, everything else should be perfectly fine to incorporate into the soil. And one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we add plenty of organic matter to our soil, not only it's really the fact that as it's breaking down, it's going to create a better soil structure. So it's going to improve that better air and water filtration. That's going to allow it to be a lighter soil. And not only that, it's going to provide nutrients that are going to kind of break down and release over time. It also improves water holding capacity. So if you have better water holding capacity, that is the ability of the soil to hold water in its pores and dry out more slowly. So by adding the organic matter, you're not only allowing more air into the soil for the roots to breathe, but also still maintaining lots of water for those roots to keep drinking up. On that picture there, you can just kind of see the difference between a heavier clay soil the heavy clay soil compared to nearby soil that has organic matter mixed in and it's been allowed to kind of to develop. So that's one of the good examples of why we can add organic matter, make the soil better. In the spring, I know it can be kind of tempting. You're adding all this organic matter, making the soil structure lovely and light, but you want to make sure that you're not tilling the soil when it's wet, or really working the soil at all anytime it's wet, when it's too wet. That's going to cause a lot of compaction and start creating a hard pan, so water is not going to go through. If you can make a ball of soil and push your finger into it and it stays together, it's too wet. That's usually the easy way to tell. If you make the ball of soil and you push your finger into it and it breaks apart, that's perfectly fine. That's dry enough. So what do we need to plant? Now that we've got to, getting the garden space and figure out where to go with the plant, the garden, how to get the garden site set up and established. What do you even want to plant? I usually recommend to start off with what you're already eating, what your family will eat. So what are you buying from the grocery store? What are you buying from the farmer's market already? Start with some of those favorites first. That way you already know how to cook with them, and it's nothing that you have to, trying to grow a brand new vegetable like kohlrabi. What do you do with it once you've harvested it? You also, not only do you not, you start with I would start with mostly things that you're familiar with, but maybe try some, different varieties of those vegetables. So that way you can kind of start seeing, not only start with the vegetables, like start off with growing tomatoes, but starting off with different varieties. So that way you can kind of see where the differences are between them. For example, another example is, broccoli. Do you just grow a standard broccoli like you see in the grocery store? Do you start growing something a little bit different, like broccoli rabe or Italian style of broccoli? They might have slightly different tastes and flavors to it and different textures, or they're just more appealing, visually on the plate in the garden. So how much do we grow? IDD 128, there's on page 17, there's table 15. It's this lovely little table here. It just kind of goes through, how much produce can you expect to get on a 100-foot row? Okay, 120 pounds of bush beans on a 100-foot row. How do you compare that to people? And that's where the next two columns go. It gives you the amount of plants to put in per person if you're just going to eat it fresh during the season. If you're looking to store, can, or freeze it, it kind of gives you the additional amount of spacing from there. So for bush beans, you want about 15 feet per person. If you want to store for the rest of the season, you want another 15 to 20 feet. That's per person. For example, if you did a family of 4, you wanted tomatoes for everybody, you grow 3 to 5 plants per person. If you wanted to can them, you want an additional 5 to 10 plants per person. So for this, during the season, it's easy multiplication. 4 times 3 is 12 at least 12 plants. For canning, you want another 20 plants. So, if you're trying to grow all the tomatoes for a family of 4 and not have to buy them at the store ever, you're looking at growing 32 to 60 plants. Not saying that it is a lot of plants, and not saying that you can't do it. Just kind of gives you the idea of, realistically how much to go with that. I think personally, I think these numbers off the book are for, especially with some tomatoes and some of the heavier producing varieties, is an overestimation of how many plants per person. You could probably go by with a few more, and that's going to be very much variety dependent. So playing out with that, keeping track of how much produce you get per plant will help you kind of refine how many plants you actually need for your household. Now that we figure out what we're looking to grow, how much to grow, when should we be planting? Again, IDD 128, it's a great resource there. It has specific planting date windows. We are in the central region. So here you can see the earliest safe planting date, latest safe planting date. So beans, typically it's the earliest safe planting date. You want to start them April 25th. That means that typically at that point our soils are warm enough, and we're mostly past that danger of any frosts, killing frosts that would be there. July 25th, that's kind of the latest point that you can safely get the plants germinated, grown, and harvested before the earliest frost. So that's kind of where those target dates are. That's kind of when we can start planting things. So April 25th, is going to be April, beginning of May is going to be your early summer crops. some of your winter crops are going to be earlier March, April. So beets, March, middle of March. Broccoli plants going to be, early March, early April, stuff like that. When you get to the point of now we've got, when to plant, what are we looking to plant? So there's 3 different ways that you can get plants into your garden. You can either directly seed the plants in the ground itself. You can grow your own transplants if you're up to it, or you can buy transplants from a store. If you're seeding them directly, some of this changes depending on the different crops. Some methods work better for different crops than others. If you're buying transplants, I would always look for healthy, short, stocky plants that are deep green. I really recommend avoiding plants that are already in bloom or setting fruit. They're putting their resources at that point, while they're in that little bitty pot, instead of growing the roots, the root zone, or strengthening that stem into blooms and fruit when they not necessarily having the best environment to grow those things. So it's really best to look for the ones that are not. They'll catch up on their own. For direct seeding, this really works best for most of your squashes, your cucumbers, beans, peas, corn. Those all work much better typically from direct seeding than you would on transplants. Not that you can do transplants with them, but they tend to do better. Don't tend to like being transplanted that much. Other things that you typically would do a transplant for would be things like peppers and tomatoes. That's to try to get a little earlier harvest on it. So that's one of the reasons we might want to do a transplant. We start them inside in a protected area a couple weeks before we're ready to plant them out. That way they've got that jump start once they're ready to go out into the ground. Cool season crops, that's your broccoli. You're looking at planting out 5 to 7 weeks, starting those transplants 5 to 7 weeks before planting. Your summer crops, you're looking 4 to 6 weeks before planting. These transplants, once they're growing up, they are going to need a lot more light than you think they will. Our eyes are really adaptable to different light levels and terrible at determining whether it's a lot of light or not. It's good that they're adaptable, but they're not good. It's not good for determining those plants. I usually recommend at minimum a good easy start for this. Starting point is at least 4 T8 sized bulbs across the length of a flat. That should provide, and getting that light as close as possible to those new seedlings, moving those lights up just so the plants don't grow into it and burn it. That should provide adequate enough light to grow up the transplants. They're not going to be as happy as you could provide. They'll be happier if you can provide more, but that's kind of where I would say that'd be the minimum to go. If all you have is just like a single set of shop lights, you really want to go essentially run them kind of lengthwise with those bulbs instead of across. Just try to get the best light over top of it. Irrigation. When we start looking about getting the plants in the ground, in the early spring, we don't necessarily think about and probably aren't going to need a lot of water right after we plant them. Our springs are usually rainy enough that we don't have to worry about it. It's usually more of an issue of trying to get the ground dry enough to plant the garden, than it is to actually have to worry about irrigating. Not that you shouldn't consider this beforehand. Most of your vegetables are going to need about 1 inch of water per week. I really recommend using a rain gauge. It doesn't have to be something fancy or any kind of digital rain gauge. The cheap clear plastic ones work. If you're really into budget, trying to do things on super tight budget, any straight walled container and a ruler would work as a rain gauge. So a 5-gallon bucket the walls are straight enough that you can use to measure the rain on that point. You want to water, if possible, in the morning. That's going to be the most efficient use of the water. Large gardens, a soaker hoses or drip hoses will save you a lot of labor and time throughout the season. Smaller gardens, hand watering is still a good option. You just want to make sure that if you're watering by hand, that you want to make sure that you're watering just in that area right around the plant. That way you're not, potentially watering any weeds that might be in the walkways. Also, you want to avoid getting the plant foliage wet. That's going to encourage, most of our plant diseases and the vegetable are going to be fungi. And just like if you think about when do you see mold inside a house is when you get a lot of wet and damp areas. Those same plant diseases are going to need, plant fungi are going to need about the same kind of situation. They're going to need lots of wet and moist and humid environment on those leaves to infect. So keeping that foliage as dry as possible is going to limit the amount of foliage that or the disease that you get on those plants. If you do have a larger garden or only have the option of doing overhead watering, using sprinklers or whatever, you are going to be watering. It's going to be less efficient because the water is going to be evaporating in the air as it goes up and over. So it's going to be less water efficient. You're also going to be watering weeds and vegetables at the same time. So one of the ways you can kind of get better efficiencies. And then you're going to be getting the plant foliage wet as well too. So one of the ways you can try to get some better water efficiencies and to limit the amount of time that the foliage is wet is to use a hose timer. Set up that sprinkler the evening before. I like to use the digital hose timers. They're for what the size of the item is, they seem like a little costly, but they will last multiple seasons. I've been using one for 5 years. I think they're $20 or $30. And you can set it to come on at like 5 to 7 a.m. That's going to be your best time to be watering that garden if you're doing overhead. You're going to typically going to have better water pressure if you're on city water, because especially at that 5 a.m. not everybody's up and taking showers yet, so they're not drawing on the city those water lines. So you have better water pressure there. It's also great because it's going to actually allow that foliage to dry out quicker. Seems a little water's hitting those plant foliage, it's actually knocking the excess dew off that plant. So that way, when the sun comes up, it doesn't have to burn off as much dew. It's just whatever is kind of dripping out the edge of the leaves instead. Weeds, this seems to be always kind of seems to be that downfall of vegetable gardeners is trying to figure out how to do weed control. The biggest thing I can say there, there's multiple ways you can control them. You can use mulching to kind of help cover and prevent them. You can hand pull them. There's mechanical weeders, so using hose and tillers and stuff to break that up. You can even use flame weeders as long as you're careful. They're a lot of fun. You just want to be very careful with it, obviously, because you've got a torch on a stick. Herbicides can be used, but they're really, really tricky, and I don't typically recommend them in a vegetable garden. It's if you can keep them out of the vegetable garden, not only are you limiting your chemical exposure, but you're less likely to miss the target and kill the plants, the vegetables as well. Mulching is by far my first recommendation for any kind of weed control. Mulching over the top of that is going to prevent a lot of your troubles. As far as weeding tips, you want to make sure it's really important to control those weeds while they're young. A little bitty seedling is going to be a lot easier to pull out than established. A dandelion seedling is going to be easier to pull out than when it's been sitting there all summer and feels like it's 2 feet down in the ground. So if you can spend a little time just to walk through your garden every day or two, just to pull whatever weed seedlings are coming up. Look for any diseases and harvest what you can at the same time. If it does get away from you, that's not the end of the world. The big thing you could do at that point is, if you can't get out and get them all pulled out, is to keep those weeds from going to seed. That's going to help limit them from becoming a bigger issue in your garden. When you're using, another big thing is if you're adding any compost, you want to make sure that it's either been pasteurized, sterilized, or it's a well composted manure. A lot of weed seed, if you get it directly from a feed pad and it's not composted, it can still have a lot of weed seeds in it that pass through the animals' bodies. But if it's properly composted, it's getting up to 165 and pasteurizing that soil. So if it's properly composted, it will kill off those weed seeds. Another big thing that can help is to keep the border areas free. So making sure that you're mowing it on a regular basis or using a string trimmer to kind of keep those weeds from growing up and going to seed and getting in there. You also want to avoid using any mulch that has soil mulch and seed that could be infested with weed seeds. So if you have a mulch pile on the back that you've had some weeds growing on top of it, it's best to pull that top layer off and place it someplace where it's less of an issue or more tolerable to have some weeds, and then use the material that's farther deeper in that pile. Talking about mulching, this is a really great option for a lot of your plants. Not only is it going to help control that weeds by keeping those weed seedlings from being able to see the sun, it's also going to help reduce your diseases. So a lot of our diseases are overwinter in the soil, so they infect the leaves. Those little pieces of the leaf, turn brown, crispy, and dry. They fall back to the soil before we can get them all out, and then next spring they produce spores and reinfect. Typically by rain hitting the soil and splashing up onto that soil surface, onto the leaf surface. So if you can create that mulching creates a physical barrier, so those diseases it's more difficult for those diseases to get back up onto those plants. It also is going to conserve your soil moisture, so you're creating a barrier so that moisture that's in the soil is not going to evaporate out quickly, especially in that dry period. Big thing, I know at least in Franklin County, a big thing is the fact that it's going to reduce your erosion. So if you can always keep that soil covered, either with plants with roots in on them, or mulch of some sort over top of the soil. If you're on a hillside, it's more prevalent. It's going to be less likely that soil that you've worked so hard to build up is going to wash away. So trying to preserve all that hard work soil that you've built from washing down into the streams. It's also going to keep the vegetables cleaner. So if you've got strawberries, like in that upper picture, it's going to keep the strawberries from getting muddy. Going to keep your watermelon. Also, benefit there is that if you've got it mulched into the aisleways, if you have aisleways that you've mulched as well, even if it's rainy, you're going to come out of that garden a lot less muddy than if you left it bare soil. Types of mulch to use, I really recommend, I prefer using some sort of organic material for this. And this would be any kind of compost, leaves, straw, newspaper, cardboard, anything that's going to biodegrade over time is going to be organic, material. It's going to be made of something that was living at one point that will break back down. You can use synthetics, things like the plastic sheeting, landscape fabric, geotextile fabrics. Those can work. The benefit there is the fact that because they're not breaking down, you usually can get multiple years out of them. For example, here's landscape fabric. I know this is something that gets used a lot in some commercial operations where they do some raised bed. They'll kind of put this over top of a raised bed, and they'll use this plate, or even instead of using a metal plate, you can make this out of plywood. Now you have your predefined planting space, your plant spacing already. So that way you have wherever all the individual plants are supposed to be at, and only the plants in those holes are going to be able to grow. So the only space you might have to weed is in and around each individual plant, not in between it. As far as fertilizing, again, you want to make sure that you're doing this based on the soil test. But you want to make sure but you can use a lot of different sources to get that nutrients in there. Compost, you can add compost or fertilizer to it, either one. Ideally, you want to make sure that adding some compost or fertilizer before the plant, just before you're planting, And most plants are going to benefit from a little, what we call side dressing. And all this is adding a little bit of fertilizer alongside of the plant, about 6 inches away, part way through the season. And just kind of give them an additional nutrient energy boost to it. Compost is definitely a great option. If you're looking for the most budget-friendly option, way to get fertilizer and nitrogen into the soil, urea is going to be your cheapest option. Most of our soils in Kentucky rarely need any phosphorus. I think it's like 10% of the soils in Kentucky need phosphorus. And very rarely do I have to make any recommendations for potassium, for the NPK. Rarely do they need that P or the K. So most of the time, most of our vegetable gardens just need that nitrogen portion. Urea is the cheapest option if you don't have good access to a large compost pile. If you're side dressing, it really just needs to be about 1.5 ounces per 10 feet of row. Just saying that out there, just because I know in the ID 128 it tells you, I think it's still set as ammonium nitrate. Been after them a little bit. I think that went from it might be the ammonium nitrate or 10-10-10. I don't recommend the 10-10-10 just because of the phosphorus level in it. It's going to start leaching into our waterways and lowering our river quality. So the urea is your better choice. ID table 27 and ID 128 kind of gives you the different application timings to keep with beans. So this would be if you're doing going to do a second harvest of blooms of your on the beans, on bush beans. You put the initial fertilizer compost down initially. After they have a heavy blossom instead of pods, you could go through and add a side dressing there just to kind of give them a boost and help them get that material, that produce up and going. Another big point of gardens is diseases. This is usually mid-season people will start calling offices saying with different disease problems. You can eliminate a lot of your disease and insect problems just through integrated pest management. So this is regardless of whether you're trying to do a garden organically or willing to use conventional chemicals or not, chemicals and fertilizers. Integrated pest management is really the way to kind of start off and head off with most of your problems. So the big thing there is make sure that you're maintaining your garden hygiene, cleaning and sanitizing your tools on a regular basis. That's where you're keeping the garden weed free, making sure that it has good drainage, making sure that the garden plants are as healthy as possible. You want to build up that soil health. That's big way of adding that soil health is just by making sure that you're occasionally adding that organic matter into it, compost or something like that. If you know you've had have problems with, but if you notice that you've had diseases or insects in the past, looking for those resistant varieties for the previous year, that's going to limit how much time you have to how much trouble you have to, or how much work you have to put into these plants for next year. If it's blight resistant tomatoes, it's not going to be immune, but they're going to be less likely to get that blight. It might be that the blight is only a small spot and only comes in late season after most of the harvest. Another big point is to make sure that you're watering and fertilizing appropriately. Don't want to overwater it or over fertilize it. Or under water and fertilize. Both those two extremes are going to encourage diseases and insects into there. I know a lot of people think more is better, but if you add too much fertilizer to it, you're going to create a lot of flush growth, and that's going to encourage a lot of diseases and insects in there. Another big thing final thing you do to kind of really to help minimize your soil, your pests and diseases is make sure that you are rotating your crop on at least a 3-year cycle. For example, this is just a quick setup. I got tomatoes and peppers here in red together because they're in the same family. So when you're rotating, you want to do it by the plant family. So tomatoes, that's all the solanaceous crops, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, eggplant. They kind of want to move them together. I've got beans and grains, squash and yellow corn and herbs. Obviously, you can swap these out to whatever you're actually growing. So if we're starting with the tomatoes and peppers on the left, the next year you might move them to the center. That way, and kind of shift everything together around that point. Third year, you've moved them out all the way to the right side on year C. The more different crops you are growing, obviously, and the more spaces that you have, the more different areas, the more years you can rotate before you go back to the same spot. In this situation, once you hit year C, the third year, you're going to go back to having the tomatoes and peppers all the way to the left. And that kind of starts over that rotation. Big point of it, one of the reasons we want to do this is every time you're moving it, most of your diseases are going to, mentioned before that they're soil borne. They're going to be living in that soil, mostly directly below that plant where the dead disease leaves fall. So by moving the plants around in the garden, you're also moving the plants away from the diseases. So that way the soil has a chance for those diseases to kind of wear down over time. At the end of the season, just because the plants are done, you've harvested everything, doesn't mean that you're done with the garden. You really want to make sure that you're cleaning up that garden as much as possible. As soon as a plant is done growing, I usually recommend getting it out of the garden as quickly as possible. Pull it out, put it in your compost bin. But if you leave plants in there after you're done with their harvest, they're useful. It's just an opportunity for diseases and insects to kind of grow and build up onto those plants. It's also taking up valuable space that you could be growing, starting another crop of a different crop or a same crop in that same space. At the end of the season, if you've got time and energy, you can try to help plant a cover crop over top of this. This is just a crop that you would put down over a period, like if in the middle, in the winter, you grow up late fall to get roots in the ground, get something green on top. Not only is it helping hold the soil in place, keep weeds down, but in the spring, when it dies, you can till that down, roll that over and either use it as mulch and plant directly into the cover crop if it's winter killed, or mix that into the soil, and that is going to be your compost to help build that soil. Like I said, composting, any kitchen scraps, anything, I would really recommend, if you don't have one, to start a compost bin. It can be simple as what's listed there is a couple pallets. It doesn't even have to have a structure around it. You could just be a pile where you just kind of keep everything up in the corner. If you like some sort of structure, the cheapest option I know of is to use chicken wire. Grab a roll of 3-foot tall chicken wire, if you use 10 feet of that chicken wire into a loop, that'll get you about the right size for a compost bin. Of course, just like the beginning of it, you start off by making notes, and making a map. I would recommend making any notes at the end of the season. What did you like? What you didn't like? Are you, hopefully you're not going to make a big note at the end, never do this again. Make any ideas of what you want to do for the next season. Kind of start planning and dreaming already for the next year at that point. And then, of course, you always kind of want to make sure that you relax and enjoy your garden as well. Reference ID 2028. Easiest way I can refer to that is to get everybody there is to search any web browser, search UKY ID 128. It should be the top list. I know I have some copies of last year's ID 128. They're coming out with a new version now. I imagine all the other extension offices will have to let you all know whether or not when they come in the newest copy if anybody needs it. But I know I have several copies that if anybody needs, we can get you a hold of the paper copies if you need that as well. With that, I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. Great presentation. Very helpful information. We do have several questions, and I just wanted to say I did put the link to the ID 128 Vegetable Gardening Protected, the newest version, in the top of the chat. You can find it in there, the link, and then I think they said in a couple weeks we would get the new version to offices, but like Adam, most of the offices have last year's version, and not a whole lot has changed. So The first question for you, Adam, is soil test for raised gardens. It says, and that it's bags of soil from the box soil, it sounds like is what they use to build a raised bed. So what about soil testing for that?
So soil testing for your raised garden, I would still recommend doing, regardless of where it's from, I would still recommend doing some soil test for the raised garden. When you're taking a sample of soil, sampling from your soil from any garden, I usually group them together as you would want to treat them. So if it's a single large garden bed, you want to sample across that as one place. If you're doing raised beds that are all kind of from the same sets of bag soil from the box soil store, I'd probably take samples from all of those. And when you're taking that soil test, you don't want to just take some soil from a single point. Really, you want to take at least 10 spots kind of randomly scattered throughout the garden space itself. So either all across, 5 or 10 across each bed, put in a big bucket, mix it together, and then that would be, you just need about 2 cups of soil for your soil test. And that will give you a good idea about where that's from. And as far as the bags of soil from the box store, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. There are numerous different recipes for raised bed garden soils. I think the last one I heard from from one of our specialists was 50% compost, 50% soil, or one, I can't remember now. It's like 40, 40, and 10. I want to say of compost, topsoil, and maybe perlite or peat.
Peat moss.
Peat moss, there it is. I can't remember. I'm pulling this off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that one. We can get you the information, that exact one if you need. How and when to incorporate a cover crop before planting. There is a publication out there that is compost on winter cover crops for gardens. The easiest way to plant that, to do a cover crop, is going to be to use a cover crop that winter kills. So that means that it's going to grow up and have a lot of biomass, a lot of material before, and then once we get to those cold temperatures, it dies back down. That's the easiest way to get that there. Incorporating it, if you get a large mass into it, you can if you have a large, strong tiller, it might be able to kind of break that up and put it in. If not, string trimmer or push mower, set kind of the highest point to kind of chop that up so they can incorporate further in. I've even used, if it's taller stuff, I've used, I can't remember, I think it was oats before. And instead I just kind of, it was oats or rye. And so instead I just kind of took a board on some string and kind of crimped it over and used that for mulching too. So that's another way, instead of incorporating it in, if it's something like a grass cover crop, you can just push that over and kill it that way once it gets to it starts heading out. Looks like remove cover crop like sod or till it under. I would till it under. You're adding organic matter to it. So it could be tilled under like a, yeah, it will, I think that could be tilled under and will be like compost, but perhaps sucking up a little nitrogen, seeing spring crops killed off with a short-term herbicide or opaque plastic cover. So yeah, you can use a herbicide to kill it off, or some plastic covering, black plastic or something over top of it, a large tarp. Usually if you can time when you mow it or kill it over, you can kill it off without any herbicides over it. So it's usually right before it flowers is when you want to kind of do any chopping of any persistent cover crops, and that typically will kill off most of it. And then you can either incorporate in, typically you'd incorporate in 3 to 4 weeks before you're getting ready to plant, just so it can have a chance to do the initial decomposition and not tie up the nitrogen. If you're planting in pots on a patio, what soil do you recommend? I would recommend quality potting soil, potting media, not soil. I would not use garden soil in a container. You want something that's peat or core based, coconut core based. That's going to have, probably with some perlite, it's going to allow a lot of nutrients to flow through it, or a lot of water to flow through. You're probably also going to have to fertilize on a regular basis or use a slow release fertilizer. That's going to be that would be my recommendation, is to use a slow release fertilizer. I think if it's new potting media, I don't know. I think most of them come at least with starter fertilizer, slow release mixed in. I haven't seen many that don't have a slow release mixed in anymore at this point. I think it's kind of a standard thing now. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, but just any, I wouldn't, yeah, just any potting soil. I'd avoid the potting soil. I'd avoid the cheapest stuff that you can. I have not had good luck with the stuff from the dollar store. It doesn't seem to have a tends to be kind of a, when you open the bag, it comes out coming like a brick. And it doesn't get much better than that. So from my experience, at least. Faye, you have any better experience from dollar store potting soil?
I would say not, but I have not tried it.
You haven't tried it? Your
No.
cheap side hasn't kicked it that much?
If I'm trying to do a lot in pots, I'll usually get the bales of Pro Mix that are like 3 cubic foot, and it's just a base, peat moss mixed with some perlite and vermiculite. And that's a good option if you don't want the slow release added in there. But
the bales are probably the most economical choice, just because per cubic foot that you're buying. Yeah. See, I have several walnut trees near my garden and battle squirrels. Do I need to worry about disease issues? I think that's 3 questions there. The walnut trees can cause an issue, especially the sensitive ones near like tomatoes. You'll know if it's too close because the tomatoes are really sensitive to the walnuts and they'll start wilting partway through the season. Squirrels, a cat or dog is probably the longest term solution. Yeah, they can be a little bit difficult to deal with. You can try the different wildlife deterrents. So either hanging something shiny that moves with the wind. Those kind of scare tactics, you have to move those around on a regular basis. The big giant yellow balls, owl mimics, stuff like that can help deter it. You want to do those kind of things at the beginning of the season before they get established behaviors going. They also make deterrent, like chemical spray-on deterrents, not chemical necessarily, but they're usually made of either processed, blood of some sort or large predator urine. They smell awful, and you have to reapply them every time it rains. I've also seen, I haven't had a chance to, I haven't played with them. I know they have motion sensor water sprinklers that are supposed to go off every time there's a thing on it. I've never been brave enough to put it in the garden because I'm going to be the person that forgets to turn it off before I walk into the garden and get sprayed with it. I don't know of any other better thing to do other than to cage the whole thing. Grow larger.
I was really more worried about like their feces and stuff into the soil. Like I had a garden last year, and yeah. I mean, they weren't that bad actually. I mean, they would, once the plant would get established, then they were good about not digging too many of them up. But I was just worried about them going through and is that an issue that I need to worry about? You're
growing outside, so there's always going to be, unfortunately, we're growing outside in the world, in the environment, so there's always going to be some poop around. Right. Whether it's from squirrels, birds, or whatever. The biggest thing you can do there is to make sure that you're washing the produce before you eat it. Just like you would at the grocery store. Just take it in, rinse it off well. Mulching over top around it is going to help with that too. Most of your summer crops, most of the time when I see them in, chipmunks and squirrels digging in there, it's because there's freshly turned soil and they're digging to make sure that there's nothing there that they want to eat. Right. And typically by the time you're growing your crop and getting your crop off of it, it's had a couple weeks to kind of decay and break down at that point. So if you're really concerned about it, once you see that soil, the squirrel activity go down, mulch over top of it, that's going to kind of help add a physical barrier between that, any kind of squirrel feces and the disease plant itself.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I put a layer of plastic in the fall. I planted some garlic and I put a layer of plastic over top of it for a little bit. And I was just amazed at all of the feces that was on the top of the plastic. And so it just made me start to think like, wow, that's a lot of something going on there.
Yeah.
So
and it could be, at that point, it could be squirrels, chipmunks, rabbits, all that stuff that's going through the garden without you seeing it at night.
okay.
It's one of those points that I probably long-term, I would just say it's something to be mindful of, but not lose sleep over it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. And Patty, yeah, Miracle Grow works. Any of the brands, Miracle Grow potting soil would work. Don't use the garden soil of whatever brand it is. Usually if I'm at a big box store looking for potting soil, if it's a new brand I'm not sure about, I usually will look down the sides of the pallets, and there's usually at least one broken bag somewhere, and you can kind of peek, put your finger in a little bit and see what's coming out of that already open bag, to see what that texture is already. And it should be kind of a light peat, mostly peat or bark based material, and not feel like a brick inside. That's usually my trick on if I'm not familiar with the brand. Miracle Grow from the race bed had less plastic in it. Yeah, it kind of, sometimes you get different qualities from one year to another. It depends on the brand and where they're producing and bagging it from, whether or not any contaminants are in it. I would just check out, if that's the case, I would probably just go ahead and open it and kind of check it out before you just dump it in. If it has plastic in it, and this year for any of it, I would probably take the bag back to the store.
Any other questions? Oh,
I had tree trimmers drop their sawdust next to a tomato patch. The row next to the pile of sawdust where the stunted and turned yellowish. The sawdust in the process of decaying, decomposing, had sucked the nitrogen out of the soil in that row of tomatoes 3 feet away. That's a perfect example of why not to use raw woody stuff. Though that's probably not the case. It's not sawdust and wood chips aren't sponges, and they won't suck nitrogen out of the soil. The issue is when you start incorporating raw wood material into the soil itself. Sawdust is worse because it's more surface area to the weight ratio, so it's going to break down and tie up nitrogen faster and use up the nitrogen in the soil first. Sawdust and wood chips can be perfectly fine on top of the soil. It's not going to suck nitrogen and nutrients out of the soil itself. It's good at best. It's going to be just at that eighth or quarter inch tops layer of the soil where there's going to be a slight nutrient deficiency. Good news, most of your plant roots are going to be within the first top 6 inches still, so they've got plenty of other soil to grow and use the rest of the nutrients for. It could be that sawdust tree trimmer had walnut in it or some other heavy tannins wood, or it could have been the heat of it decomposing, radiating onto the plant. That would be more like, I would think that would be more likely would cause the stunting and turning yellow.
all right, well, we're coming up a little over an hour now, so if there are any last minute questions, you can drop them in now, but if not, thank you everyone so much for joining. Adam, thanks for a great presentation, and hopefully you'll be joining us for our next couple sessions coming up next Thursday and the following Thursday. We have berries next Thursday and raised bed gardening the following Thursday, and then soon we'll be launching our April, May, and June classes. So be looking out for that. But thanks everyone for joining today. Go out and enjoy the sunshine.